ninth, 2 and 2 is the count. 2 outs and a man on third. The pressure is on for these young men. They've all worked so hard for this moment. 1 run is all they need to win it all.
Morning. Hey, it's on now. That's probably operator error. I'm sure it was. Good morning. It's good to be here. It's good to be back. I hated being gone last week. I actually had a wedding in Rochester, Minnesota, so I was not around. But it's good to be back this week. I always hate being gone from church and being away from my home church. But it's good to be here this morning. We're in week 3 of a series called Bottom of the Ninth. And just talking about those moments in our lives when we get to the bottom of the ninth. And we talked the first week about just stepping up to the plate. And then Pastor Mark talked about remembering last week. And we're going to talk about another subject today with regards to the bottom of the ninth. But how about those Cardinals, huh? Woo. Yeah. Bottom of the ninth, I think they used all of their hitting in that last game with Atlanta. We're just done. But bottom of the ninth, and the fact of the matter is, the Yankees bid it too, so it's all good. Houston's going. But we have definitely all faced bottom of the ninth moments. And I don't know, just out of curiosity, anybody really enjoy losing? Anybody? Is there anybody that would say, yes, I just really enjoy losing in life and in everything else? Nobody really enjoys that. Let me ask you a different question. Do you have who are movie watchers? Do we have movie watchers in here? People like to watch movies? Okay. Do you love a horrible ending? Anybody love just a horrible, the ones like Cheryl? Cheryl's not a movie watcher. She very rarely watches a movie because she can't stay awake past the first 10 minutes. It's like, welcome. But anyway, when she does invest the time to watch a movie, if it doesn't give the whole here's the happy ever after and here's what happens and they all get married and live happy, beautiful lives, she's ticked off. She's mad at me. If it ends poorly, the movie ends poorly, she's really upset. And, nobody likes that. I don't like that. I don't like, I cried when Old Yeller died, I don't know if anybody else, just me? Okay. So you don't even know who Old Yeller is. But sometimes the good guys don't win, and the Bible, but when we think about these bottom of the ninth moments, and you think about those moments in your life when you're faced with these difficult, drama-filled, action-packed moments in the bottom of the ninth, in your life, regardless of whatever that is, you read about all of these kind of moments throughout Scripture, and the Bible is chocked full of these moments. I mean, you have Daniel in the lion's den, and he's been thrown in there, and if you know the story of Daniel, that was definitely a bottom of the ninth moment for Daniel, right? He was down there with the lions, but then God steps in the bottom of the ninth and shuts the lions' mouths, and then we read about Moses, and I mean, really from the time he was born, he was in a bottom of the ninth moment. I mean, he was floating down a river in a basket, and over and over and over throughout Moses' life, you read this story of how God intervened in the bottom of the night, just at the right moment, standing on the edge of the Red Sea. I mean, there's just these bottom of the night clutch hits that God comes through for Moses, and in the end, you're like, yes, you live for that kind of ending of the movie, and then you have Jonah, who goes from being really basically fish food to evangelist. He's obviously he's got to be thinking, and he's in the belly of this well, going, okay, this has got to be a bottom of the ninth moment for me in my life. I don't know how much worse it gets from that, and then God steps in and pukes Jonah out on the. It's just these cool cool stories in the Bible that you read all the way. David facing Goliath, he brought a rock to a sword fight, and I love that song by Casting Crowns that's out. But you read about all of these stories, and the Bible's just full. I mean, look at Jesus. I mean, it looked pretty bad on Friday, right? On Good Friday, it looked pretty bad for Jesus, but we knew that Sunday was coming, right? And God stepped up in the bottom of the ninth. And then you just get this home run, in the bottom of the ninth. It's just these action-packed stories that are really quite amazing, and they all have this common theme of comeback, right? We love a good comeback story. We love to watch the underdog win. We love to watch these guys step up and go, man, you didn't see that coming, did you? And we read about those, but they all went to the bottom of the ninth and won, But the reality of the fact is that doesn't always happen, does it? And so this morning, I want to spend some time talking about a guy, a Bible character that you may or may not know. But you come across a guy named Stephen. And I don't know if you know who Stephen was, but Stephen, we run across him in the book of in the book of Acts. And if you've not read much of the Bible and you don't know the story of Stephen or have never heard about Stephen, some of you may know if you've been around the church who Stephen was and what his job. But I want to talk to you a little bit about Stephen this morning. And we come across his story in the book of Acts. And Acts is just a really cool book because it chronicles. When you dig into the book of Acts, it's the period of time that was immediately following the death and resurrection of Jesus. And then these people were left. I mean, it was the bottom of the ninth, really. Jesus was like, oh, and then he's dead. And then they had been on this roller coaster of emotion of, oh my goodness, Jesus is dead. What are we going to do? Oh my goodness, he's alive. We're gonna take this thing. And so there was this rush of emotion and these people coming to know and believe in Christianity. And really, what formed in the book of Acts is what we have today that we call church. It was a group of people. It was this group of ecclesia of people that got together and said, hey, we believe that Jesus is resurrected, and we believe this is news that can change the world, and we believe that this is something that we should share with everyone. And so we had this. So when you read the book of Acts, it's just if you like drama, you should read the book of Acts because it's just chock full of drama and this. And I get my head wrapped around this period of time and how exciting that must have been. I mean, they were sharing everything. These people were doing life together. They were walking with each other. Oh, if you had a need, I would sell something and I would give it to you. And it was just probably a really, really cool time to be part of a church and feel that sense of community that these people felt. And that's really where we pick up the story. It was such a bustle and we had people coming to know Christ and giving their life and believe in Jesus Christ. And so the disciples were incredibly busy. They were preaching and teaching, and Peter and John and these guys were preaching and teaching, and so they were super busy. And so as the church began to grow, basically they got really, really busy. And so we meet Stephen in chapter 6. And so what happened is, just like any good church that starts, there's always a little drama. Right? And so there are these widows, and these disciples were tending to widows and orphans. And there were some widows that belonged to the group who felt like they were being overlooked on the daily food distribution, right? So there were like some widows in the church were like, hey, I only got one loaf of bread instead of two. I'm getting overlooked here. And so the disciples were busy preaching the word, but they had to try to figure out, okay, we got to deal with this problem. We got to deal with this. So they hired 7 guys. They found 7 guys, and they said, hey, we're going to delegate some responsibility to these 7 guys. And Stephen was one of those guys. He was a devout man of God. He was one of the good guys. He was good people. And, the disciples had stuff to deal with, so they delegated that, and he did an amazing job. People were coming to faith everywhere he went. He did so good that Stephen did such a great job tending to people's needs and meeting their needs and telling them about Jesus that people everywhere began to go, wow, and their numbers began to grow and grow and grow and grow. And so this got the attention of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And I'm just kind of giving you some backstory about Stephen and what his job was. So his job was really hired by the disciples. His job was to take care of these widows and orphans. He was feeding them, making sure that the food was distributed on a daily basis. People, he was ministering to people, talking to people, telling people about Jesus. The numbers began to grow. People became to be followers of Jesus Christ, and they began to follow him around. And so much so that it got the attention of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And these are the same guys that had just crucified Jesus. Those are the guys you don't really want to get the attention of. And so that's kind of the story here. And they had Stephen in their sights. And these guys were ruthless and would do anything. They would make up anything to stop a movement that was church and Christianity. And so we pick up this story of Stephen right there. And they seized him. And they decided they wanted to arrest Stephen and put him on trial. And they had some guys make up some things about him, and they told bold-faced lies, and that was just kind of their MO at the time. That was what these teachers and Pharisees and rulers of the synagogue did at the time. They would just make up these. They would get a bunch of guys and say, "Hey, we'll pay you to say this about Stephen." And so they said some bad things about Stephen that weren't true, and so they arrested him. And so now, the guys made up some things, and the same thing worked to crucify Jesus, so why wouldn't it work so it was just the same pattern. And Stephen may have been in the bottom of the ninth moment in his life, but this probably was the biggest bottom of the ninth moment for Stephen in his life. After they confronted Stephen and with these trumped up charges, the priest looks at Stephen and asks, "Hey, are these charges true?" And at that point in time, he really probably could have said, yeah, it is as you say, and just kind of gone with it. They probably would have, told him to stop or do something else. But not Stephen. He's got these charges that have been trumped up against him, and he's in the bottom of the ninth moment. He's dealing with the same guys who just crucified Jesus. And he could have just said, yeah, that's what you said is true. I'm sorry. I won't do that again. But what Stephen does is he steps up to the plate and he points for the left field fence. And he starts swinging for the fences. He grabbed his bat. He stepped up to the plate. He swings for the fence. He wasn't looking for a walk. He was looking for a home run. And he started a speech. He started to give a speech. Instead of just saying, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I'm sorry, I won't do that. He launched into this speech. And you can read the speech in chapter 6 of Acts. And he begins on this litany, and he starts just tearing into this speech. And he starts all the way from the beginning of Abraham, and he begins to go tell all of these stories that these leaders and synagogue leaders would have known. He begins with Abraham, and he begins to tell all about how the Jewish people had run away from God and done things that they were doing just now. The entire Jewish history. You can read about it in Acts chapter 7. And he was really sure and to point out all the places in history where the Jewish people had turned their back on God. To make the point that these guys were doing the exact same thing. And so to drive it home, we're going to pick up part of his speech here in chapter 7, verse 51. Here's what he said. Mind you, he's talking to the guys who have made up things about him and who have just literally crucified Jesus. Same people he's talking to, okay? Just want to get you. Here's what he says to them. You stiff-necked people, your hearts and ears are still uncircumcised. Now, these guys were already ticked at Stephen. Now they're just flat out mad. And he doesn't stop there. He just keeps swinging for the fences. And it's one of those moments, if you're there and you're in the crowd and you're a friend of Stephen and you hear him step up and give this speech and you hear him say, you stiff-necked people, your hearts and ears are still uncircumcised. You're in the crowd going, oh, no, he didn't. He did not just go there. And probably some of you are like, oh, no, Stephen, no, don't go there. Don't go down that path. And he keeps going in verse 51. He says, you stick-necked people, your hearts and ears are still uncircumcised. You are just like your ancestors. You always resist the Holy Spirit. Man, talk about a message. He's like in their face. You always resist the Holy Spirit. Chances are, throughout history, there have always been people. Did you know that? There have always been people who resist the Holy Spirit. Some of you may be resisting right now. You're here, but you're resisting all the things that God is telling you. And the Holy Spirit is telling you. Same thing it's the same people that Stephen was talking to here. He goes on in verse 52. Was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one. And now you have betrayed and murdered him. You who have received the law that was given through the angels, but you have not obeyed it. Stephen is preaching them a sermon. I mean, he is letting them have it. Well, as you can imagine, the elders and the Pharisees were not overly impressed with Stephen's speech. But Stephen was bold, wasn't he? I mean, why not? Why not look these guys in the face and call them out and point them and call them in on the carpet? And I mean, after all, he had heard all the stories. He had heard the stories of Daniel and the Hebrew children and Moses and Abraham. And he had heard his whole life of how God had intervened. So why not be bold, right? Why not just go straight out there and just be bold and say it? Because God's got my back. I know he's going to have my back. I'm here doing God's work. I'm feeding the children. I'm feeding the widows. I'm doing God's work. I'm doing what the apostles have asked me to do. I'm a man of God. I'm paying my tithe. I'm doing exactly what I need to do. So why not be bold? Because God always comes through in the bottom of the ninth, right? What should we fear when God is batting cleanup? He knew all the stories. He knew the Old Testament is full of those kind of stories. Verse 58. They dragged him out of the city and began to stone him. Hold on, wait. This is Stephen. He's a good guy, right? He's feeding and caring for widows. I mean, he pays his tithe to the Jerusalem Synagogue Building Project, you know. Surely God is going to protect him or remove him or prove a point to the entire world. He's going to use this, right? And if you're there, if you're part of Stephen's friends, you're waiting for that. You're waiting for God to step up and hit a home run in the bottom of the ninth. He's batting cleanup. This is Stephen. They're dragging him out to stone him. You're waiting at some point in time for God to step in and do something amazing. Like all of a sudden the rocks are going to turn into sponges. It's going to be like Nerf stone, you know. Or there's going to be some kind of invisible force field that's going to pop up. It's going to protect Stephen, and he's not going to get hit. Or when the rocks hit him, they're going to turn to dust. Or something crazy is good. It's going to be some kind of part to see Hebrew children in the fiery furnace thing that's going to happen here, right? If you're in the crowd, if you're watching what God had just done with Jesus, he raised Jesus from the dead, for crying out loud. Surely he's going to step up for Stephen, right? Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. And this was a big event. People were coming out. They were expecting God to work a miracle. Everybody, his friends and neighbors were saying, hey, watch this. This is going to be good. God's going to do something right here. After all, it's the bottom of the ninth and it's Stephen. Verse 59 says this. As the witnesses came, all these people came out to stone Stephen. They laid their coats at the feet of a guy named Saul. Pay attention to that. Verse 59. while they were stoning him, as he's getting hit in the face with rocks, while they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, Lord, receive my spirit. And then he fell on his knees and he cried out, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. I told you he was one of the good guys, right? I mean, that's a good guy right there. When people are throwing rocks at you, people are literally trying to kill you with rocks. And you say, Lord, don't hold this sin against them. I got TP'd last night and I'm upset about it. People are throwing rocks at me, trying to kill me. This is one of the good guys. He's a good guy. He's done everything right. He's better than me. He's better than you. He's probably better than all of us combined. This is a good guy. And then if you're standing in the crowd, maybe you're just sitting there going, okay, wait a minute. Surely this isn't happening. I can't believe what I'm seeing. Like God's going to do something, right? He's going to step in, right? Maybe God is waiting for the last minute. I mean, a 3-0 comeback is cool, but a 14-0 comeback, that's awesome. You know? Verse 60 says, and when he had said this, he fell asleep. It doesn't mean he took a nap while they were throwing rocks in his face. He died. It's over. The good guy, the hero of the story, died. And God did absolutely nothing. Luke didn't mean that he took a nap. God didn't save him. He didn't remove him from the stoning. He had saved Daniel in the lion's den. And he had saved Peter and John. He'd come through for Abraham. He literally stepped into the fire with the Hebrew children. Moses lived in the bottom of the ninth, and God kept coming through for him. He raised Jesus from the dead, for crying out loud. Why not Stephen? Why not Stephen? He was in the bottom of the ninth moment in his life. But God didn't remove Stephen's loss. What are we supposed to do with that? What are we supposed to do with that story? Have you ever felt that in your life? Have you ever been in a moment and then you're like, you know what? Seriously, God, this is how it's going to go down? About 23 years ago, my brother-in-law, who was 19, some of you know the story, but left here on a Wednesday night after coming to youth group and on a motorcycle with his friends and got hit and in an accident. And I can remember walking into the emergency room out here at Salem ER. It was one of the bottom of the ninth moment. I'll never forget seeing him laying in there. But I'll never forget a verse that kept popping in my head in that moment. It was like, the prayer of a righteous man is powerful and effective. Prayer of a righteous man is powerful and effective. And I thought, man, we could just pray this out. It's going to be good. God's going to come through. It's going to be the bottom of the ninth moment. He's going to get out of here. And a few days later, we buried him. We have those moments, don't we? You have those moments. Many of us empathize with Stephen. Maybe not giving speeches and getting hit in the face with the rocks. But we've been in those moments, haven't we? We know people who have been in those moments. Maybe it's in your finances. I mean, you've been in debt, but this is different. Like, this is foreclosure debt. Like, the bank is throwing rocks, and you prayed that you wouldn't lose your job, but you did, and now there's somebody else living in your house. It's over. Maybe it's in your marriage where, you were in counseling and everything was going okay, but then you found out that he was still having an affair. And you were willing to try to repair the relationship, but now he's marrying her, and it is over. Maybe you're in the game of parenting, and you were able to maintain hope that your son or daughter didn't have the addiction. And you've spent countless money on counseling and different things, and you don't have any other options. And maybe he or she is in prison, and you feel hopeless, and his life is the life is just troubled, and for all intents and purposes, it's over. Maybe you're a couple that's tried to get pregnant, and you've tried, and you've paid money and spent all kinds of money that you didn't have, and it was your last attempt, and now you're done, and this game is over. Maybe it's your health, and you knew something was wrong, and you received a diagnosis, and it was confirmed, but then hospice was presented as one of the treatment options. And it doesn't feel like the bottom of the ninth. It feels like it's over. We prayed and we hoped and we came to church and we prayed some more, but we went from being at the bottom of the ninth to feeling like you're just down and out. Do you know 95% of baseball games are lost in the bottom of the ninth? Aren't you glad you came to church today? There's more to the story. The full story of Stephen teaches us how we should live even when we lose. Because let me tell you something. There are going to be moments in your life when you lose. And how we respond to that and how we deal with that determines the trajectory of things that maybe are beyond our thoughts and imagination. Here's the truth. When Stephen died, some of his friends, I assume, picked up his bloody, mangled body and buried it. And it was game over for Stephen. But here's what happened. As a result of that, if you read throughout church history, and this is the part of the story that we don't often hear, if you read through church history, here's what happened. Massive, and I mean massive persecution broke out against Christians during that day. And Christians scattered. They fled. They fled. If Stephen were around, it would have felt like being salt rubbed in his wound. But he was gone. He wasn't there. But as the Christians fled, and as they ran for their lives, guess what happened? the gospel began to spread into Jerusalem and throughout Jerusalem, in places like Judea and Samaria. And through the course of time, Christianity would spread through Europe and eventually to America and ultimately to Salem, Illinois. Because somebody lost. And what we learned from Stephen, here's what we know to be true, is you can be used even when you lose. God used Stephen for good, even though he didn't rescue Stephen for his own good. Do you hear me? God can use you and me even if he doesn't remove us from the suffering and the pain of our losses. How we live will ultimately determine if we can be used. Most of us miss out on this because in the bottom of the ninth moment has a way of focusing it just on ourselves. And on the bottom of the ninth moment, we're thinking about our circumstances. So if we can shift our focus from why didn't God remove me to how can he use me, it opens up a much bigger field of opportunity. And this should be great news. Because being used when we lose is something that we can choose. Do you hear me? Let me say that again. I have to read it. Being used when we lose is something that we can choose. We can choose that. I don't know if you remember the part of the story where people laid their coats down as they were coming out to stone Stephen. People laid their coats at the feet of someone named Saul. He was basically the coat checker for the stoning event. If you know the story, Saul, interestingly, that coat checker became the lead Christian persecutor that scattered people throughout the world. He saw Stephen killed. He chased Christians and they fled. He watched as persecution helped to grow their faith and build their strength. And then ultimately, if you know the story of Saul, what happened? He had an experience with Jesus himself and he changed his life. And he changed his name to Paul. And as Paul's life unfolded, he certainly experienced his fair share of bottom of the ninth moments. Paul, who had this miraculous change in his life, who was the coat checker at Stephen's stoning, had experienced Jesus, and it changed his life. And he wrote most of the New Testament, and he traveled all throughout, taking the message to the Gentiles. But at the end of his life, and sitting in a prison in Rome, waiting his execution, he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was it for him. He knew beyond a shadow of a doubt he was facing execution. He was going to lose his life, but he never saw it as a losing the game. In fact, he reflects on his life and impending death and writes a letter that sums up the approach that's being used. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7, he says, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race, and I have kept the faith. I'm going to ask Jeremy to come. I'm going to ask Jeremy and our band to come, if they would. And if these things, Paul points out these three things. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. In these three things, we find the secret. The first one is fight. You know, as they're coming up, and I've watched Caden play baseball his whole life. I think the time, just like any other kid in Salem, they get a bat and ball when they're little kids, and you stick them on a t-ball team and watch them pick dandelions and learn how to play. And one of the things that would always drive me crazy as a parent, though, was when Caden always has a knack of getting down in the count. You know, like it's He watches 2 perfect balls go by, and it's 2 strikes and no balls, and he's standing at the plate. I think the only thing that always drove me crazy was when he would stand and just watch the 3rd one go by. As a dad, you're like, why? And so one of the things I've always loved about him is he'll swing, He'll step up and swing. He doesn't always hit it. But that's what Paul says, when I fought the good fight. He's talking about that fight. I'm much happier when he takes a swing. And no matter how bad it seems, God can use people who are willing to go down swinging. So fight the fight that you're in right now. Point to the left field and take a swing. Finish. Sometimes, even when we fight, we still lose, but sometimes we swing and miss. When we finish well, we create a unique context to be used by God. So finish what you've started. In faith, Paul said, I've kept the faith. I fought the good fight. I finished the race. I have kept the faith. And this one's probably the hardest one of all. It's the biggest challenge of all, is when the game is over, we must keep the faith. Faith believes we can be used even when we lose and even when the pain isn't removed. The fruit of the fight is fight, finish, and keep the faith. I don't know what you're going through. I don't know what kind of bottom of the ninth moment you're in. I don't know. The game may be over. The last pitch may have been pitched. You swung and missed. I don't know how God's going to use that in your life. You may not ever see it. Stephen, maybe we'll get a glimpse of it. Maybe we won't. Stephen had no idea. He didn't get a picture of, hey, Stephen, when you get stoned and you lay here and die in the street, that this is going to actually spread the gospel throughout all of the world, and people are going to come to know Jesus and are going to still be talking about your story in 2019. He didn't know that. You don't know how God is going to use your story. But keep the faith. Fight the good fight. Finish the race. Pastor Mark.
What a great message this morning. And one of the things that I think is so powerfully unique about our faith in our culture in which we live is our culture doesn't have a place for losing. Doesn't have a place for a time in our life when things aren't going so well. We tend to just forget those people and those times when things don't turn out the way that we think they should. Or we believe that somehow they did the wrong thing, or we blame the one who loses. But I'm telling you, Jesus Christ went to the cross for us and laid down his life and died and was put into a tomb. And on that 3rd day, Jesus was raised from the dead, showing us that even when all looks like it's lost, there is still hope because of what God does after the bottom of the ninth. So wherever you're at this morning, Stephen knew that. That's why he could die with the very words of Jesus on his lips. And you need to know that this morning. Whatever you're going through, how dark it seems, whether you're at the bottom of the ninth and ready to give up, listen, keep fighting, keep believing, keep trusting, and you will finish well. Christ will see to it, because the power and the promise of the resurrection is yours. Let's stand together as we get ready to be